We talked, I want to say, a year ago about how the Vancouver Canucks and the Toronto Maple Leafs were indeed on the brink of a Roberto Luongo trade back in the day. Well, we are revisiting this topic because, like the Sebastian Aho video yesterday, Brian Burke came out publicly and talked about this in a way that shed some new light on some new information that we didn't have access to before. Brian Burke was the Toronto Maple Leafs general manager for a period, and he was fired back in January of 2013. Here's a little thing on Twitter. He actually asked fans to ask him some questions, and he replied to a lot of these questions and gave all the fans reading his Twitter feed some insight as to the inner workings of the NHL, the teams he worked with, and the stories that he had to share when he was living those experiences. Take a look at this. This is a question from Mark_VDG. He asked Brian Burke, what trade did you work on with the Leafs that would have shocked the world, but never quite came to fruition? Brian Burke replies, we were all in hard on Roberto Luongo around the time when I got fired. Now, before we go further after that, okay. When Brian Burke was fired, that was in January of 2013. So, with that in mind, we will continue with this tweet. The price would have come down to a lot, but the Leafs were in the mix. The Canucks asked for Gardiner, Kadri, and 2 firsts. Way too steep, even for @Strombone1, who is obviously Roberto Luongo. There was a time in history where we didn't know who Strombone1 was. We thought it was Roberto Luongo, but then we thought it wasn't because of how often he was tweeting, but eventually we learned that it was indeed Luongo. But that's what the Vancouver Canucks trade request supposedly was. Gardiner, Kadri, and 2 firsts for Roberto Luongo. Now, because I am a somewhat relevant hockey YouTuber, I know that I'm going to garner fans from both the Canucks' point of view and from the Leafs' point of view on this video. So before we get into this analysis, if you're a Canucks fan, comment down below. Would you have done that? Gardiner, Kadri, 2 firsts for Luongo. If you're a Leafs fan, would you have done that? Gardiner, Kadri, 2 firsts for Luongo. Keep in mind that Kadri, Gardiner, these 2 guys aren't on your team anymore, and the 2 firsts, well, we'll get to those 2 firsts. Now, initially people were thinking, okay, 2 first-round picks, what does that mean? Well, Roberto Luongo was traded in the 2014 season before that came to an end. So that automatically means the 2 first-round picks the Leafs were talking about were the 2014 first and the 2015 first, right? That's the only logical explanation, because that's when Luongo was traded. The 2014 first for the Leafs ended up being William Nylander, and the 2015 first ended up being Mitch Marner. However, that's pretty inaccurate. Brian Burke says immediately in the tweet at the beginning that the Luongo trade was close to happening around the time that he got fired, 2013, a year before Luongo got traded. So, in this context, what we would have been dealing with was a 2013 Jake Gardiner, a 2013 NAZEM Kadri, a 2013 first-round pick from the Leafs, which ended up becoming Frederick Gauthier, and a 2014 first, which ended up being William Nylander. This means that we have ourselves a deal of what would have been Gauthier, Nylander, Kadri, and Gardiner for Luongo. Now, Roberto Luongo was indeed traded a year later to the Florida Panthers in exchange for Jacob Markstrom, who, granted, is very, very good today. Sean Matthias, who, let's face it, it's Sean Matthias. The guy isn't a Canuck anymore. The guy spent some time with the Jets. He spent some time with the Leafs. And that was it. That was it. It was actually Luongo and Steven Anthony, a Vancouver Canucks prospect who did absolutely nothing with the Florida Panthers. The guy played in the ECHL, he played in the U Sports recently, but the Canucks traded Luongo and this guy to the Panthers in exchange for Jacob Markstrom and Matthias. Granted, it took Markstrom a very long time to become what he is today. This trade was 6 years ago, and Markstrom has only really started proving in the last, let's say, 16, 17 months that he is a legit number one goaltender. So, another question for Canucks fans. Would you rather have had Jacob Markstrom and Sean Matthias, or NAZEM Kadri, Jake Gardiner, Freddie Gauthier, and William Nylander? That changes things up tremendously, especially knowing what you know now about Thatcher Demko. Does that change up the dynamic of how you perceive this trade? For me personally, it's weird to take a look at what would have been in place. Obviously, Berkey came out and said, yeah, no, that's too much, we're not going to do it. But what if they had? What if Brian Burke, in a desperate attempt to save his job, went out and pulled the trigger on this? What if he gave those picks up? And furthermore, what would the Vancouver Canucks have done if they had another 2013 first and if they had a 2014 first? Now, when the Leafs drafted Freddie Gauthier in the 2013 NHL entry draft in the first round, other players that were available in that spot were Emile Poirier, Andrei Burakovsky, Hunter Shinkaruk, who was taken a few picks after, Shea Theodore, Marco Dano, and then a few other players in the draft later on. The best player in that spot, if the Vancouver Canucks were picking, probably would have been Shea Theodore, and it wouldn't have even been close. Even the Hunter Shinkaruk pick later was not that great. Maybe the Canucks would have taken Hunter Shinkaruk with that one and taken somebody else with their next pick. However, the really intriguing one is the 2014 pick, because that 2014 first rounder ended up becoming Nylander. And the Canucks had picked Jake Virtanen in 2 picks before that Toronto pick was even used. If the Vancouver Canucks had the first round pick of the Maple Leafs in 2014, who knows, maybe they would have traded up for a Sam Reinhart first overall from the Florida Panthers. That's something that everybody was talking about when the draft started too, that the Canucks had a package including Shinkaruk, including the 6th overall pick, that would have went up to first overall. Obviously, that didn't happen, though. So, revisionist history comes in and says, hey, if the Canucks had 2 first-rounders in the top 10 that year, would they have gotten Sam Reinhart? And at that point, you have yourself a Luongo trade that turns into a Jake Gardiner, a NAZEM Kadri, what would have been a Freddie Gauthier, and instead of a Nylander, you trade that pick off and you get yourself a Sam Reinhart. That's a lot of thinking, isn't it? And it freaks me out to think that this was the brink of reality that almost happened if Brian Burke had chosen things a little bit differently. Personally, I would have loved to see Jake Gardiner and NAZEM Kadri on this team. This team would have been so incredibly different, so incredibly weird from this normal reality that we have lived in over these past few years, that it would have been so interesting to see how a NAZEM Kadri would have fit in. The Vancouver Canucks eventually signed Radim Verbata a year after, and then they had 70 points out of the Sedins, and they made the playoffs, and Bo Horvat made his debut. If they had a Gardiner and a Kadri with their team, and a few years down the line they added a William Nylander or a Sam Reinhart after a few trades, the core of this team would have been so different, and the way this team would have progressed would have been extraordinarily different from what we had in the past. 2014 was a bad year. It was a lottery year, and it was a year where the Canucks absolutely stunk. So, if they added a potential 50-point center in NAZEM Kadri, and at the time, a potential 30 to 40-point defenseman in Jake Gardiner, how would it have been? I don't know if I want to think about that. It's too different and it's too weird thinking about these guys in the blue, white, and green. But ultimately, that's the information that we have received from Brian Burke, the general manager on the spot at the time, on what the details were and how it would have gone down if he decided to pull the trigger. So Leaf fans, Canucks fans, comment down below what you think. How interesting is this? I know it's very, very weird to think about, but how different would these two teams' timelines have been if Luongo went to the Leafs and if Kadri, Gardiner, Gauthier, and Nylander ended up in Vancouver? Imagine having Virtanen and Nylander on the same team. Oh my goodness. Imagine Nylander playing with Pettersson. Okay, I'm just really getting ahead of myself. Hope you enjoyed this video. So, and bye.